So again, this is an MS Conversations Now event. My name is Stuart Schlossman. For those that don't know, I am president and founder of MS Views and News. I too have multiple sclerosis. All right, as I already told you, David here is interpreting tonight's program, and he's doing this primarily because Dr. Erica Ali asked him to do this. And as the American Sign Language Interpreting Specialist lead at the Center for Health Equity within the Minnesota Department of Health, Dr. Erica Ali is dedicated to driving systematic change to enhance communication access for Minnesota's deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf-blind communities. In her role, she delivers as coordinates ASL English interpreting services for MDH staff, community organizations, and service providers. With a Master of Arts in ASL English Interpreting, a PhD in ASL English Interpreting Research, and pedagogy, something like that, a national certification from the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. Dr. Ali supports the CHE team's mission of delivering accessible information. There's on and on and on and on and on. There's a lot of things going on here, but what I want to also let you know is Dr. Erica Ali is or works with a group that are hearing impaired that have multiple sclerosis. Is that not true, Dr. Erica?
Dr. Erica, that is true. Yes. So I currently work for the Minnesota Department of Health, but I'm not serving in I'm not a representative for MDH right now. More so, I am talking about how I am engaged with the deaf community and patients who have been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and I've just been really enjoying my work there and wanted to branch out and work with the deaf community for other health-related reasons as well.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So let me introduce this program. Good evening, everybody. I just want to welcome you to this MS Conversations Now, MS Patients' Voices. And as you can tell who our guest is tonight, Erica Ali is a doctor. As I already mentioned, she's got a PhD. And interpreting for tonight for this event is David Evans. So I want to thank them again for being here. And now let's get back to Erica. I'm going to call you by your first name because it's just so much easier.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Definitely.
All right. Firstly, let's start with the basics. Are you married? I'm not hitting on you.
Is that relevant? No, is that relevant at the moment?
Is that relative? Well, it is, because I'm going to ask you some other questions of how this pertains to your work and about you having multiple sclerosis.
I am not married, but I didn't realize that had any influence on my health and well-being.
It doesn't. But do you have children? And do your children and or your ex-husband, have they ever helped you with you having multiple sclerosis?
Yes, I have children. I have two children, and they are 11 years old and 6 years old, and they are both they're CODAs, I call them, the children of deaf adults. So their father is deaf, and we've been living in this community for a very long time. And so one of the things that they do when they're helping me out, I call it, they're absolutely wonderful about remembering things that I don't remember, but also because the three of us are bilingual. We know sign language, we know English. They do a really good job of, there's a back and forth sort of way that I often handle things. I can't remember a word or how to say something, and I remember it in ASL, or I can't. And so I've been doing that for a very long time, where I go back and forth between languages, which is a way that actually I had not been diagnosed earlier, was that as an interpreter, I know how to say things in a different way. If I can't remember how to say it the way that I had intended the first time, it's literally what I do on a daily basis is I interpret. I say something that somebody else is saying, and I search for words and how to say it in the best way possible every day. So I switch back and forth between English and ASL, and both of my children are fluent in American Sign Language, so they're wonderful about that too.
That's excellent. Thank you. And a lot of what you just said is like what's done with speech therapy is if you cannot remember a word in a certain way, then you look for another word and see what can get you onto your path of what you're trying to speak about, correct?
Absolutely. So things like moving from a main point to a detail. If somebody says something with a specific number or a specific date and I forget which day it was in that specific month, then I can expand it and say in the month of, and then I move a step back. I had been doing that for a long time, and before I was diagnosed with everything on a daily basis, I would forget how to say something or I would be searching for a word. Nobody would ever notice that anything was wrong because I would ask questions instead of make comments, or I would cover it up in a way unintentionally, not knowing that I was doing anything that wasn't what everybody else does rather. Because if you say to somebody that you forget, when did that happen? They'll go, oh my goodness, I forget things all the time. Or if you say to somebody, I can't see that, that's really far away. They say, oh, I forgot my contacts that one day 2 years ago, and that happened to me too. So I had been covering it up without realizing that that was something that I was even doing.
That's good. Thank you for that. So other than having occasional processing issues, do you ever find that you're getting fatigued during the course of your day? And well, I'm talking about when you're at home. And do your children help you out with that?
I don't necessarily have fatigue. I more so have things where it's a lot of memory forgetfulness. So a lot of where did we put that, or a lot of something that I know that I have whiteboards all over the house. I keep notes everywhere so that I know how to make sure that I remember when something has to be done, or that I have to pick somebody up from school or something. I have all of those little tricks that I have laid out around the house to make sure that I don't forget things, but I don't necessarily have fatigue problems where they have to help out around the house. No. I'm very invisible illness. I know that that's like one of the things that I wanted to discuss as well, but I'm one of those people that you would never realize anything was wrong until I fall apart at some point, when I start dropping things that I attend, or I start to reach for something that I wanted to pick up and I miss it and it's not, yeah, I do those types of things.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, so let's talk about when you began working. I mean, you do work. I do know that you're working, right? So can you tell us when you began working and when actually you began? Did you first do interpreting, or were you doing something else? Or tell us how you fed into doing interpreting.
Sure. I started interpreting in 2006. So I've been doing that for, I want to say it's about 17 years now, for a really long time. I was a staff interpreter at Gallaudet University beginning in 2008, 2009, I want to say. Gallaudet is a school for the deaf, a college for the deaf in Washington, D.C. So I was there and I was serving as an interpreter. I went and got my master's there. It started in that way first. Got my master's there, stayed and never left. Became a staff interpreter, and then they opened a PhD program. And because I was working there, it was announced and I was really excited about it. So I stayed and served as an interpreter while working on my PhD. And then I was hired out here in Minnesota, serving as a professor and a freelance interpreter around here. And so I moved out to Minnesota.
You like the weather?
Not really. You get used to it. So it's not as bad as the first year that you're here and you're thinking, oh my goodness, I'm never going to survive this. And now I'm thinking it's not that bad. Yep. You get used to it.
Yep. All right. Thank you for that. By the way, how I don't want to say that. How long ago were you diagnosed? I'm not asking you how old you were when you were diagnosed.
That was a good catch on your part.
Thank you.
I was diagnosed 2 years ago, and I was hospitalized for 5 days. I fell apart, just couldn't see anything, couldn't remember anything, and it was going to be happening. I knew that I was on my way down. I lost my vision weeks before then, but I had covered it up thinking like, well, everybody was at home with COVID, and so we were all on our computers far too much, and so I thought that my vision was probably going down the drain because I looked at a computer too often and I haven't left my house in a while and all of that. And I was hospitalized, and that's when they started doing testing, and they found that what they've been calling as, I've had MS, what they said is like for decades. I've had it for a really long time, and I've just been covering it up and not realizing that anything was wrong. And so I wasn't diagnosed until 2 years ago, but I've had it and I've strategized ways around it for years.
So thank you for answering that. What eye-opening, no pun intended, experience did your MS diagnosis offer you?
Eye-opening. I think that I have been working with people with disabilities for a very long time, whether it be deafness and interpreting for people, or whether it's with working with children in an educational setting, deaf children in an educational setting, because it's very important to emphasize that deaf people, when you're thinking about a disability, it's not necessarily, I mean, it's a cultural aspect of life. It's a part of who people are. It's an identity. So I don't necessarily think of it as looking at a deaf person and saying, well, they have a disability, but more of a strategized way of thinking, how can we get them access to this information in the most efficient and effective way possible. So I've always been thinking about disability in that lens, thinking of disability not as being something that you have to look down on or tell somebody that they can't do something, but rather a way of us opening our eyes to think about strategy. How can we get that information to these people? How can we share this opportunity that others have with these people? And it's not that we need to do anything that is in a negative way, making it less of an opportunity or making it less of an accomplishment, but rather opening a door to something that they should have access to in the first place. So the eye-opening, no pun intended, part of it is that I have been working with people who others have looked at as people with disabilities for a very long time. And then when I started being looked at as a person with a disability, it reframed my way of looking at anything. The way that people treated me or talked to me or thought of me was a lot different than a week prior to that, when I hadn't had that diagnosis before. So you get diagnosed with a disability, and then it takes time for you to think about whether you can accept the fact that you have a disability, identify as a person with disability. So if somebody asks, if you're filling out forms, if any of that is happening, how do you identify, how do you share with others that you do need something to be a little bit different, that you need the print to be a little bit larger, any of those types of things. It reframed my way of thinking about the concept of a disability, because it used to be that I was fighting for others to not be looked at as people with disability, and then I had to start fighting for myself not to be looked at that way. It changed the way that I consider things.
Okay, thank you for that. Before I continue, I want to let everybody that are online to know that if you have a question to ask Erica, please type it in. So at the top of the toolbar, there's a red or an orange box, depending on how your server sees it, with an arrow in it. Please click on that and type in your questions. You are not seen, okay? So we cannot see who you are, but I'm the only one that knows who's typing the questions. I am not going to say your name unless you want your name mentioned. And if you do want your name mentioned, or if you want to say, hey, where you're from also, you know, I'll announce all that. Okay, but I will ask Erica your questions. I can stop and ask the questions during the program. I don't have to wait to the very end. So if you have something to ask, because it's probably very relevant to what she was just talking about, then just ask it, and I will ask it. Okay, thank you. All right, and there are a couple of questions online already. One is saying, are there other communication modalities for the deaf population?
Other than American Sign Language, there are varying ways that people are raised. So they may use a form of sign language that's closer to an English base, because it depends on how old you are when you're diagnosed and the way that you prefer to use language. So there are varying ways that people sign. There's also different signs for different things in different states. It's not a one-size-fits-all American Sign Language and everybody says it that way. Similarly to the New Yorker in me continues to say soda, while everybody in Minnesota says pop. It's the same thing with sign language. So there's variation in speed, or variation in the way that people express themselves in different places and with different people. So it varies, yeah.
Okay, next one is lip reading taught or encouraged?
It depends. That's one of my students say that I say it depends a lot. It depends. It depends on the parents of the deaf child, if they know sign language or would like to encourage, it depends on the level of hearing that the child has. If they are more comfortable with learning in that way or speaking with their family in that way, in that environment, but then speaking with others in a different way. It also depends on your hearing as you get older, if it changes in any way. It may be in some situations. I have a lot of friends in medical situations, if we go back to the MS component of this, that look at what the doctors are saying and look at the interpreter, so they can see the concept of what's being said and they can get the information that they need, but then they also can get those little bits of information that they'd like to see directly from the person who's speaking. It might be that they understand their parents or their siblings pretty well if they're lip reading, but if they go into a conference or a presentation, less so. I'm not going to say that anybody likes one thing or another, because every single person is going to be different.
Okay, thank you for that. Another one writes that often they see an interpreter aside from using their hands, but showing facial expressions. And they want to know if those facial expressions are up to each interpreter or if that's just something that, how the person feels at the time.
It can be affect, meaning the emotions that somebody are trying to show, but it's also grammar. So there is grammar in your eyebrows, there's grammar in your facial expressions, we call them non-manual signals. So if you are trying to emphasize something or you're trying to show a concept of movement, or there are facial expressions that have grammatical meaning and or context type of meaning as well.
Right,
plus
thank you for that.
How people
What's
feel.
that?
Is that plus it shows how people feel depending on where you are and what you're doing.
Sure. David looks very happy right now, so that's a good thing. So you mentioned being close to deaf people. Can you tell us how so?
Yeah, so initially I had been very close with deaf people as a student at Gallaudet University, because it is a school for the deaf, a college for the deaf. And I was out there for a really long time, probably a good 9-10 years, as a student, as a staff interpreter, as an adjunct professor. So I had been working out there for an extensive amount of time. A lot of friends and colleagues. So you have the work environment that you're meeting people you're on a daily basis, interpreting for others or speaking with deaf people who you work with. And so other professors that I work with who are deaf, or other colleagues that I work with, interpreters or whomever. So I have that work environment, but I also had that friendship environment where I have so many friends and colleagues that I speak with every single day. And that really helps you develop language proficiency, because it gives you that language outside of a classroom. So it's not just that you're learning language in a classroom, but rather you're out and speaking with people. And here in Minnesota, it's the same. I have friends and colleagues and everybody that in varying forms of how I know them that are either deaf or hearing. And then I know but I know some MS patients that are deaf as well. And they have been wonderful connections, because after I was diagnosed and I started trying to figure out how to remember things or how to say things, or how I joined an MS group, a group of us, because there was a deaf person within that group who was just an excellent support system. And it was wonderful actually to go to those meetings, and there was an interpreter there, and I found that I was relying on the interpreter sometimes because they weren't there for me, but I'm listening to the presentation, and when somebody said something and I just couldn't get it at that time, I had a second opportunity to see what they were saying by looking at the interpreter. I also had a wonderful deaf friend, or I have a wonderful deaf friend, who when they would ask me questions in the meetings and they would say, have you ever tried this medication, or what are you doing at this time? And I couldn't remember, she remembered those things for me. So she's wonderful as well.
Great, thank you for that. And do you find, percentage-wise, are there as many people with multiple sclerosis that are deaf as a percentage of others in the population?
You know, I'm not going to be able to say that, because that's one of the things that we couldn't possibly know the percentages or amounts of people. And I wonder that one as well, because if we're thinking about those who are diagnosed at a certain age, or who we have identified as having MS, and those who have not yet been diagnosed, I think that we're not going to be able to get an accurate number on that. I think that a lot of the states, I know Minnesota, for example, we do have those demographic type of information where we send out medical inquiries and surveys and things of that nature, where we can look and see how many people are diagnosed, and not just who has MS, but who has MS, and then race and ethnicity and all of the other factors that pertain to them. So we're looking at whole people and the variation, the whole intersectionality of them. I don't know that all states are doing that, and I don't know that everybody who has MS has been diagnosed. So it's one of those things that I'm not going to be able to say. What I do think, though, is that because information is not always available or accessible, they're probably finding one another, I hope. But I'm not quite sure that they're participating in the same events that we go to or the same meetings that we have access to, because I'm not sure that it's available to them. I'm going to give you an example. So Marcia, and I'll call her name out because I know she's the person that has helped me along the way the entire time. She has been there for me when we have those MS meetings. And similarly, I've been there for her because when she wasn't going to were the lunches that everybody was going to, because those aren't under the whole national organization associated with MS. That was just our community wanting to get together and get some pancakes,
Right.
you know? And so we go there once a month. And I have my students who need to learn how to interpret with deaf people outside of a classroom join us, and they have been offering interpreting for her or for other people who are actually there, because there's several of us now in that location. So it's an opportunity for them to practice, and it's also an opportunity for the deaf community that want to get involved. So I'm not quite sure percentage-wise, but I do know that there are people out there that we are probably overlooking.
Thank you very much for that. Is there a way to do like an online support group for using social media for hearing impaired?
Absolutely, and it's very similar to everything else that happened during COVID. Even if it wasn't available before, they're finding ways now. And so we have a lot of meetings via Zoom or via Teams or any of these types of environments similarly. But there's also, so there's chat boards and discussions, but there's also live opportunities to get together and connect with people, and via video, I mean. A lot of organizations, even if they historically have been meeting in person, post-COVID, they're finding ways. People are finding one another. And clearly we have an interpreter here right now. This type of language and this type of interaction is possible. We just have to offer it.
Thank you. And yes, I wish he could see that I'm saying ouch right now because I just did something to my foot. But okay, next, here's an excellent question that just came in. In your opinion, should sign language interpreting be offered more frequently in the corporate world?
That's going to differ, and I'm going to tell you why. And it's not whether I think it should be, because I do think that everybody should have access, who needs to have access to opportunities, because we don't want to take employment opportunities away from the deaf community. We want that to be an open opportunity. What's going to happen, though, is that the different states, based on it's federal, larger, and then it's also the state level, we have to look at what the ruling is about how many people need to work in that environment, how big the company is, whether they're required to provide an interpreter. So there are rules based on, because of the financial responsibility of providing an interpreter. If you have a small business, they're not going to be required to provide an interpreter in that particular setting, but those larger corporations are required to provide an interpreter. And so when you see larger business meetings, or you see medical offices, this is even an example. If you have a medical office that's a larger hospital, they're required to provide an interpreter. Then we have to hope that they have one, because if it's in like a rural area, they might not. And if they don't, then we get to the telecommunication, like you were just saying. We have telehealth, and we have our interpreter wheeled in via video. But if they are if it's a smaller type of home business, like not mom and pop shop kind of thing, but if it's a smaller business, they are not required to provide an interpreter, and then you have to look for a different place to go often, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Is there an opportunity for opening a private practice in sign language interpretation?
There are freelance interpreters, and yes, you can develop an LLC. You can, which I have an LLC based on freelance interpreting. You can go out and interpret. Potentially, if you have that connection, you're interpreting independently for those people, or you're joining an organization or an agency and you can freelance with them, which means if they are getting the assignment sent into them, they send out a call for interpreters, who's available, this is where you're going, and then the interpreter can look at the list and say, that's close by and I don't know that person, so I can go. And there's a lot of those are going around with business or medical or legal or K-12, meaning educational environment. We're everywhere.
I would think that there would be more private individuals doing this per state than we would even imagine. All right, next question. Is ASL taught to foreign speakers, or are there other sign systems?
Other sign systems, we all have a lot of different languages. So if you are in France, they have French sign language over there. If you're in Canada, it's going to differ. Like I said, with the States, it's just like you're having an entirely different language in varying countries and different locations. It differs.
If you were at a program that was provided and asked for there to be 2 languages interpreted, is that possible? I know you have to have more than one interpreter, that's obvious, but would it be a good idea to have an interpreter there for English and in Spanish, per se?
Happens all the time. We have trilingual interpreters as well, so it could be that they're going from Spanish to American Sign Language or English to Spanish to that happens frequently in educational environments when you have families, because the deaf child comes in and their parents speak Spanish, and now you have teachers who speak English. And so those types of environments, or medical environments, there's trilingual interpreting in general, and that's not just related to Spanish. That's a lot of different languages, not all are trilingual.
Lost her.
People, but we have, depending on the community in which you live, there are.
So, Erica, we're losing you, your
interpreters that you work with, and it might be that you have several with you. So you have somebody who is Hmong, or can you see me again? Oops.
You're in and out. You're in and out. Maybe David can sign to
can you hear me again?
That you're in and out.
Sorry.
Is there anything on?
Okay.
That you turn off?
Well, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. You just.
Let's find out. I don't think so.
But
I'll try.
Gerbil. You're a little fuzzy and you're like a gerbil.
It happens sometimes.
So, okay.
I'll give it a shot. I'll see if I can fix it.
That's what happens in that city in Minneapolis. Things are just different up there.
Okay.
All right.
There's not even any snow today.
I'm going to ask you if your laptop is on and you have and you're connected to other things on the internet, can you shut those other things off so that way it gives?
Sure, I can do that.
Okay, we'll give you 30 seconds to do that, but don't think that we're in a rush here. Just take care of it as quick as you can.
Nope, absolutely. I am taking care of it now.
I don't want you to feel like I'm putting pressure on you in any way, shape, or form. Okay.
No pressure. I'm good.
Yep. No pressure. Just
no
get
pressure.
it done.
It is. We're working on it.
Okay, I got it. So while we're working on it, can you do 2 things at the same time?
Sometimes it depends, but go for it. We'll try.
Okay. What did you learn about the difference between visible and invisible illnesses?
I learned that it is I learned that it's interesting. I learned that even having an invisible illness, what you'll call it, or an invisible disability, it's you have to make a decision on when you're going to be talking to people or how you're going to talk to people, and when you are going to look at a specific situation or an interaction, and where do you have to tell people and where you don't. And it's interesting for me at this time, because what I've noticed is, because it can be often overlooked that anything is even going on with me, I'm actually addressing it by making it not public information. I'm not posting like social media about it, but I am not trying to hide it. Because, for example, as a professor, my students, I tell them on the very first day of class, every single semester, what you're going to notice about me. So, for example, I need them not to have different things on their shirts when they're using sign language. So they can't come into class with a plaid shirt on, because my vision makes it that I can't see it. I can't get your hands away from your clothes. And you'll notice that David and I both we're set with solid color backgrounds with no distractions. We're set with that kind of shirt or whatever it is that makes it so we can clearly see one another. But if a student comes in their plaid pajamas, I can't get their hands separate from their bodies. And so I've become open about what I particularly need. Or in something like a work situation, it's not necessarily that it's invisible or visible, but rather I'm making decisions on where I can go and what I can do, where it is most effective that I can complete my work. So that means that I'm not interpreting for a platform presentation where I'm unfamiliar with the people and they're on a stage somewhere, because I can't promise you on that day that I'll be able to see you. Even if I can today, maybe tomorrow I can, at least not clearly. Or if you're wearing something that makes it even harder for me to see you, that makes it challenging. And so I have decided, for me personally, that it makes more sense for me to acknowledge that even having an invisible disability is I have that choice where I can make it visible when I need it to be, and I can recognize what others are doing in similar situations. And so after I was diagnosed, after I felt a little bit better about remembering things and all of that and getting back into work, I started doing research on interpreters with disabilities to look at what others are doing and see how, not that everybody has MS, but if we stop looking around and thinking everybody is perfectly fine and we're all doing things the exact same way, there are so many of us out there that strategize in the way that makes our work more effective and efficient and accurate. And there are decisions that we have an opportunity to make that support the deaf community. And honestly, in many situations that I've worked, it's been beneficial to have an open conversation if needed, than to try to think that everything can be hidden or doesn't need to be disclosed. So in varying environments, point being, in varying environments, I make a choice, and whether I make what is invisible known so that I can efficiently and effectively do my work and offer support to the deaf community, even if that means that I say, no, I can't do that, because I need to accept that too. It might be that I used to have been able to do that, but now it would not be the appropriate decision for the people who are involved. And so it's a heavily decision-making process, I would say.
Okay. So when you're out there doing or covering events that are not MS related, though, do you let people know that you have MS? I mean, I know that your local community knows that you do, but going outside, do you share that to show people that you have something that hinders you at times as well?
I have. It's not that my community is so small that it's just public knowledge, because it's not that I'm not in a community where we all run into each other on the streets and we all know everybody. But
no, I was referring to the MS community.
The MS. Say that again?
I knew that the MS community that you work with knows you already, but I'm referring to others that are not in the MS community that you might work with.
Right. I don't publicly say anything, but sometimes I have noticed that it becomes an opportunity to, not to connect, how do I say this? I'm trying to share that it's not something I just widespread, like I don't tell everybody for no reason.
Right.
But if it does come up, I've found that it's been like a wonderful opportunity for people to go, like it's that shoulder thing where you go, oh, okay, we're going to be okay now, where people have that kind of like stress that they're in some situation or something's happening. I'm going to give you an example. With the students that I work with, when they tell me that they need the information to be shared in a certain way, or they can't access the information that is in the online system for this reason. When on the first day of class, there are people with disabilities, there are students with disabilities, and I've been doing this for 10 years, but there's students with disabilities that have to give you that piece of paper at the beginning on the first day of class going, or there's the email that we get saying that they have a disability and that they need this, that, and the other thing in order to get access to the information that we're sharing. And I think when I say that I'm here and I understand, people go, okay, they know that I'm not going to be somebody who's going to say, well, why do you need that? And it's not working that way. I'm very open to supporting people. And what I've also started doing, based on some of the research that I've done and based on just the way that I've been involved in this community, don't tell anybody this, but I provide all of the students this support, even when they don't have that piece of paper, because for economic reasons, for any of those underlying factors that are going to contribute to whether they have a piece of paper diagnosis or they know that they just function better in that way, I'm flexible about when they can hand in their work. And if it's not like if they're honestly trying to do things, I'm not going to say, well, you don't have that documented, there's no diagnosis there. I'm the kind of person that's going to say, I understand. How can we get you through this together? What would work for you? And so I've been supportive for them even without that document sometimes, also known as most of the time.
Okay, thank you. So what else can you tell us about access to care for a hearing impaired person? If they can't but want to see programs online or to speak with their doctors, how do they manage telehealth calls if needed?
Right. So we have a few ways of doing that. If you have a doctor's appointment and the doctor arranges for interpreting service via video, that's done. That's called video remote interpreting sometimes. So if it is that as a deaf person, they're in with the doctor, but the interpreter is via video, that's video remote interpreting. Or if they're calling their doctor because they have a question about a prescription or they need a refill or any of those types of discussions, that's video relay service. And so that is also done through an interpreter, and that is federally supported. So the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, provides video relay service for the deaf community. So people can call an interpreter who then calls the doctor and leave a message if they don't answer, or it's all of those phone conversations that can take place through an interpreter via video. But there's a lot of telehealth opportunities. I do want to mention, though, that depending on where you live and who you're working with, there are doctors that are going to say to you, well, we don't do that. Can you bring your child to interpret for you? And the parent's thinking, I don't want my child in here for my mammogram or whatever it is. That happens all the time. And so there are different ways that we all have to navigate that. And sometimes you get a deaf person who says, no, you do need to provide an interpreter, and they really get it going and they help you like start the process. And sometimes you get a deaf person who is saying, okay, I'll bring them in with me. Depends on your experience and your life and your community and what you know you have access to or what you think you can do. Because there are people who have been told the entire time that, well, that's the way it's done. And so they go, okay, because that's all they've ever been offered. So we have to work on the system. And that's a lot of the research that I do, and a lot of the work that I do is working on the system. So taking that burden off of the deaf person to think, how can I even participate in this, or how can I get information? But rather within the system, how can they know that they have to provide this information? They have to make it accessible. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Okay, thank you for that. All right. So how has Zoom and the other online companies, how has this benefited the use? How have people that are hearing impaired benefited from using one of these online systems.
Yeah, a lot of systems have changed, like I was just saying. So the education systems had changed during COVID, and classes became online, which, by the way, when you're diagnosed with MS and you have 16 students using sign language on a screen, it's really difficult. And then I had a year of a different computer like monitor next to me. So my students are looking at me over here and I'm looking at them over there. And then when I wanted to say something back, I had to look back at them and then go, it was terrible. But Zoom is, and there's a lot of different opportunities for it. So it doesn't have to be that one company, but we can navigate it and we can set it up in a way where it's everybody on screen at the same time, or you can make it so that one person is the center of attention, and then when somebody else raises their hand or pushes a button, then we can navigate over to them and you can see them or highlight them. And that, having the, for example, the ability to raise a hand and put your hand up over a computer is great, because otherwise there are systems where it's waiting for you to say something in order for you to get the camera on you. But if you're using sign language, that doesn't happen. So I've had classes, again, during COVID, where we're all using sign language, and I recorded the entire class. And then at the end of it, this is at the beginning of COVID, I realized the camera was on me the entire time. I missed the entire class because nobody said anything. We all used sign language, and the camera was set on a one-person screen. And so there are now, I think, post-COVID, a lot of wonderful technology ways of making access available for the deaf community. A lot of that is provided now.
Okay, thank you. Can you tell me about your research regarding interpreters with disabilities?
Yeah, so I'm very excited about that research because I had been a researcher. I have published articles and a book and things of that nature as somebody who's been involved in the field and working on my doctorate and postdoctoral studies, all of that. I had been so heavily involved with it. And so once I was diagnosed, I started to think that was the past, Erica. I can't do that anymore. That's not something I can do any longer. And so you hit that downfall after or post-diagnosis where you think, the prior you, and then will I ever get better? You have to start figuring out who you are and what you can do and how you identify after diagnosis. So after I was diagnosed, it took a while. It really did. And then I started realizing that the research that I wanted to undertake was looking at others out in the field. So I wasn't alone anymore as the person with a disability, because then I'm not. It's not that nobody else has anything or nobody else is doing anything, but rather as you start to open up and reach out to people, we are all strategizing how we can work and what we can do and where we can fit and where we should potentially avoid going. And so I started doing research. I sent out a call for participants and they were just filling out surveys, and then I had interviews with many people as well. And some of the questions that they had answered in the survey that then I had asked additional information during an interview was, where do you feel like you have where do you feel you are able being in quotes, where do you feel you have the ability to work? And then where do you avoid working and why? And then what do you do in these situations to strategize how you can effectively work in that situation? I've asked those types of questions. I've asked about the policies that are in place based on wherever you're working, because a lot of policies are established based on how whoever's running the show can make a profit. But it's not necessarily looking at how the employees who are working there can better access their work, how they can effectively accomplish the tasks that they're setting out to accomplish. But when you look at, or when you talk to people directly, there's the story of what you actually do on a daily basis, as opposed to just what's written on paper of what you're supposed to do on a daily basis. And so we have all of those variations. And I wanted to take a closer look at the ways that people are addressing the challenges that they're facing so that we can share that information. I think it's going to be helpful for people working out in the field and for students. I am a professor at heart. It's been a really long time, but I want my students to know you can do this too. People with disabilities, I think, often feel that they're alone and that they can't do this and others can. So for example, if you are in a wheelchair, you're going to not interpret at that location where you have the appointment's on the second floor and you can't get there. You know, we are choosing how we navigate the field based on what we need in that environment. Like I had said earlier, I won't interpret for something that is far across the room when I know I'm not going to be able to see it. I'm not going to interpret for a presentation that I'm unfamiliar with, because let's hope I remember certain like details that I want the audience to have, because that's why they got there. So I'm making decisions about where I work, and we're all making decisions about where, when, how, all of the tips and tricks that we use to navigate the field. And so I wanted to open that door and make that information available for people who are recently diagnosed, or for students, or for anyone else who could benefit from feeling like they're not the only one who's doing that.
Okay, thank you for that. Ooh, David must be exhausted. So that leads me to my next question. How long does a normal interpreter interpret for? I mean, you got to get tired. I mean, there's a lot of motion and hand action and physicalness going on there. So what is the normal length of time that you do something like when you're doing a program such as this? Not that I'm going to get David a break, but I've got to just know this.
Yeah, so language, it's a language, and so it's not like our mouths get tired and we can't talk to you any longer. So it's the same thing. It's how people communicate with others on a daily basis. That being said, there's cognitive fatigue. You're using two languages, you're taking in a language, you're expressing a language in varying ways, whether it's ASL to English, English to ASL, or anything else that you're doing. So your brain is hard at work, your hands are hard at work, your mouth is hard at work. Everything is happening. So because of that, most often interpreters work for an hour, hour and a half. If they get into that 2-hour realm, you usually have a team of interpreters. And so at that point, we would have David and somebody else who was joining, and they would tag your it style. Like they would do a certain amount of time that they've agreed upon in advance. So in advance, we would, if I was working with somebody else, we would meet prior to the event beginning and say, hopefully, if we know each other, great, we'd be like, we can do this, and this is how we're going to split it up, great. Or we're meeting each other for the first time, talking about how we feel about whether we're comfortable with this information and who has more knowledge or experience or anything else. And so we're agreeing on how we would be able to share that information. So you do have one interpreter, a team of interpreters, or in a conference setting, something of that nature, you would have more interpreters, because now you have different events in different rooms. You know, conferences where you have this presentation in one room and that presentation in another. You need more people.
That's right. That's right. So tell me how you get so dedicated to everything that you are doing.
The interpreting part of it is just been a really big part of who I've been for a very long time. It's part of my family. It's part of my life. It's part of what I do on a daily basis. And the teaching part of it is something that I've fallen in love with. I am a people person. I love working with others, and I love having the opportunity to be a support system and offer access in the field where it may not be that they've had it in the past. So that concept of opening doors and making things equitable or accessible, something I just feel really strong about, and it's something that I've always felt very strong about. That being said, after my diagnosis, I think I've been working harder on seeing what we often overlook. We often overlook things that are not pointed out to us directly until we experience it. And then it's something that once the doors open and we see it, we go, okay, I'd like to be supportive in this environment. So people with disabilities, whether it is that they have multiple sclerosis or they are deaf and attempting to gain access to something, there's so many different ways that communities are overlooked, and I'm really driven to offer information in any way that I can if it's something that I could support.
Okay. What are the ADA guidelines for the deaf?
There's a lot of different guidelines for the deaf.
Gonna make David more tired.
No, there's a lot of different guidelines, but it's not going to be something that I can say, well, the ADA says this. You're going to have different environments. So if you're in an education environment, it's going to be that the children need to be addressed in a certain way in order to support their access within that environment. Like I had mentioned in the video, in the phone environment, there's access there as well. So you have access in employment. There's different ways that access has to be addressed. So if you're in a job interview, for example, now deaf people have to think, do I tell them that I'm deaf prior to coming in and ask for an interpreter, and then they take my resume and put it off to the side and say, thank you, never mind? Or, I mean, there's different, even though they're not supposed to be doing that, it's the laws that are out there, but then it's also how we have to navigate the fields in order to be able to identify, to notice them in the first place. That's what I'm hoping for. I'd like for us to even notice that these things are happening, because that's when you can address it. It's the things that we're overlooking that I think that we aren't addressing appropriately. And it takes time, but the ADA is just like one thing. There's a lot of policy and law and procedure that has to be addressed. It's not just the one.
Thank you for that. Why did you leave your job as a professor?
I didn't. I'm still a professor. I'm still teaching.
Oh.
But I have been a professor. I've been a professor at three different. I've been at different locations. The thing that I have noticed, or rather the opportunity that I have now at the Department of Health, I wanted to get out there and join and be a part of something. I'm pretty driven in the field of health at this point, so I wanted to be involved in the community. I wanted to learn more as well. So I think that that's something that offers me an opportunity to expand my knowledge and become more understanding of, I think, real world experience. For example, I've always with my students seen this as well, but now at the Department of Health, I'm thinking of this as well, that people, when we're looking at policy and procedure, like I just said, there's so much intersectionality that we have to account for, that we need to identify as something that should be recognized, and it often is overlooked. So that was something that I wanted to explore further.
Okay, thank you. So we might have said this at the beginning, but I'm going to say it again now because there are different people online now than there were at the beginning. What challenges has your diagnosis posed to your work as an interpreter? For example, when interpreting at an event, for how long or for how many minutes in a row can you sign and or interpret? And does this ever fatigue you? And if you had made arrangements with another interpreter to be there, how do you get that other interpreter to realize what's going on so that way he or she can step in case you're fading out?
Right. I make a decision on where I'm going to go and where I would be in the first place. So there is a conscious decision that all interpreters are making on whether they accept an interpreting assignment or not. And that might be, for example, I can give you a good example. I have often worked the overnight shift at hospitals because you have the emergency room and people come in there and they need an interpreter. And so we have on-call emergency interpreters. I don't do the overnight shift anymore because I can't promise you that I would be a qualified interpreter at 1 o'clock in the morning, even though I used to be. I'm probably not now. And so I don't take the overnight shift as often. I also don't work back-to-back types of assignments. So it might be that I am, instead of doing, as a freelance interpreter, you could be in one location, then you drive to another, and then you drive to another. I might make a conscious decision on how many assignments I take in a day. So those are all things that I could take into account when making work plans. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't interpret in places where things are too far away and I might not be able to see it. But I also, or here's another, actually a good one, that I have larger screens on my computers for video relay service when I'm interpreting online, so I can see people more clearly, and then I don't have to put that strain on my eyes. That's also the larger monitors that I have everywhere. It's very helpful in being able to understand language and communicate.
Great, thank you. I was going to ask you what tricks you've learned, what strategies to mitigate the challenges that you have. And like everything that I was going to ask you, you're already a step ahead. So you cut me out like on half of everything that I had for you. And so now I'm at the point where we are now closing out. And I just want to ask, and I'm going to have to pay attention to David for this, how do I sign or interpret a thank you for you being my guest today?
And I'm going to just point out the trick that we all as interpreters do, is that we will spell everything so that somebody else has to sign it. They wanted to know, how do you say thank you for this? And we're like, da, 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 telling the whole thing. You could just say thank you. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I can't. Unfortunately, I can't see. You're under boxes, and I'm not seeing where you are. So, hold on. I'm going to get close some things that I'm going to close. Oh, I got some other questions also that people have asked. How about that? Now all these boxes closed out, and I can see them. So before I say goodbye to you, now I have to ask these questions. All right, a person named, so small, it's incredible. This is Annie in Austin. As a fellow interpreter and someone with a brain condition that is now becoming more of a disability, I am finding I am evolving in the way I choose when, where, and how to work as an interpreter. How has MS influenced your decision about your work?
Yeah, and I think that we were, I don't know when that question was asked. I think that we had started talking about that as well.
Long time ago.
Yeah, that it is influencing my decisions on work every day. And I think that, Annie, I think it's really important to just acknowledge and accept who we are and how we identify. And it's helpful, as opposed to driving ourselves to think that we should push through things. It's a reframing opportunity to think what people think you can and can't do, but also what you think that you can and can't do right now at this moment. Because I don't want anybody to think that forever I'll never be able to do that again. Because that's how I thought when I had originally gotten diagnosed. When I originally was diagnosed, I thought, well, I can't do this anymore. I'll never be able to see again, because I literally lost all of my vision, and I'm an interpreter for visual language. But time and change and things happen. So I don't want anybody to ever think that they can't do something. I want it to be how. How can we do something? So it's not a question of what you can or can't do, but it's a question of how. And I think we started to talk about that with all of the little tips and tricks that we were offering.
Right. All right. Another person wrote, you mentioned that you have figured out workarounds for interpreting and teaching through memory lapses. When your vision is impacted, have you found similar solutions to continue working? And if so, would you feel comfortable sharing?
Absolutely. So I have so many tricks, I have so many strategies, and I know that we all do. But I had mentioned earlier about whiteboards all over the place. I keep notes everywhere. And so when people are saying things that I need to remember, I literally have whiteboards everywhere with markers, and only the dark colors because I can't see the lighter ones on the whiteboard. So that's part of it. I also I have reminders that come up for me on all of like my computers and on my phone, and all of, like, I call her She Who Will Not Be Named, the Alexa stuff in my room that will remind me to like turn off the microwave or the stove or whatever it is that I have running at that time. But there are so many technology things that we can use to support our work, including for video calls. We can make things larger, we can expand our print, we can change the color contrast in our information online so that we can see it more clearly, because like I mentioned earlier, I can't see things that are in certain colors or in certain, like those fancy calligraphy type of stuff. I can't see that. And so I have little technology tricks that I do on my computer and on my phone and everywhere else in my house, and then a lot of whiteboards in a lot of places.
Good, thank you. All right, next person says, I have MS and I'm hearing impaired. When really sick, I cannot speak at all. I try to sign, but never understood. It is beyond frustrating, and I just want to tell you how grateful I am for people like you who understand and advocate for, oh my gosh, for what we need. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that I'm so happy to hear that, or for you to have said that, because I think that there, with any bilingual, I would say, but like just navigating two languages and trying to figure out how can I communicate right now when I used to do this, or I sometimes do this, or I can do this, or in the future I will be able to do that. Communication is it's different after diagnosis. Communication changed a lot for me, and it's, especially as somebody who is working in two languages, and that working, I mean functioning on a daily basis with two languages. I can use some of them sometimes and another one at another time, and we have to think about what we can do right now in this moment. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, thank you again. And thank you for everything that you brought to us today. And again, thank you for your interpreter. And I would love to be able to use you guys going forward. And we've already discussed how we're going to do this at our large event coming up. And we're just going to have to make it happen, okay? So we got to work on this quick now, all right?
Absolutely. I am excited that we can start to offer that. That's wonderful. And thank you, David, for interpreting. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to say goodnight because there are no more questions. And we're going to get this published on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And I will let you both know when it is so you can share it out to the people that you know. All right?
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And good night.
Bye.
Bye.